Hello, my name is Angelina Estrada, and I took Business Communications this semester at San Diego Mesa College. I was very enthusiastic to find out that we were able to choose our topic for the final project. So I wanted to choose something that was to my interest and something I know a lot about, something I consume on the regular daily basis, which is, if you couldn't tell already by the background, coffee. I wanted to get a little bit more in depth of where it came from, the history behind it, and the process it takes just to get that one cup of coffee. I know I was very intrigued to find out the process behind it and the history of where it originated. So I am so ready to share all of the details behind these beautiful coffee beans. Let's go ahead and get right into it. So, the first question we're going to have today is, where do coffee beans come from? Where do they originate, and what's pretty much their story? So, it really shocked me to find out that coffee beans develop inside a cherry that comes from this plant right here. This plant actually grows up to 10 meters when grown in the wild, and they actually originate and grow within a bean belt. And the area is around the equator between the tropics of Capricorn and Cancer. Those parts include Central and South America, as well as Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Um, the name coffee bean can kind of be misleading because they actually grow inside these seeds. And I was actually able to find a photo of these seeds ripe, and it does look like two maggots inside of a cherry. I'm not gonna lie, but this is what it basically looks like when the seeds are ripe and not roasted and under the process. So I just wanted to include this little photo because this is how it first is started. And here we have a map of the coffee belt and the locations of where these cherry plants can be found and where they're mainly harvested. So these places are very tropical and are where we get an abundance of these cherry plants. Also, here's another map showing the specific locations within the coffee belt. So from Central America, we have Mexico, Nicaragua, and in South America, as you can see, we have Colombia and Peru. Many people have consumed the Colombian coffee. It's just a known fact that their coffee is very strong, and I, from personal experience, have probably tried it once or twice, and it is very strong. That is definitely a very dark and strong roast of a coffee bean. That's why I decided to point that one out, because that one comes from South America. We also have from Africa, from the Congo, which I know that coffee is very strong as well. And it just really depends on the way that it's extracted. So I really wanted to include this map just to show the specific locations of where these coffee beans are being grown, and the not most important, I wouldn't say the most important, but the most major coffee growing regions of the world, as titled here. So now I'm going to go ahead and describe the process of how we get this small little seed from the cherry plants to then becoming this great beverage that we all so enjoy and somehow include it into our daily lifestyle. So let's go ahead and get right into the process. So the first and very obvious step is planting. Basically, I already mentioned the locations of where they're planted, but it is very important to know the background of how it's processed, because that can really depict if you're going to have a good tasting coffee seed, or should I say coffee bean. Planting often takes place during the wet season. That way, the soil remains moist while the roots become firmly established, and that just helps overall with the taste in the end, which is crazy. So after we have the planting of the seeds, we then have the harvesting of the cherries, which is a very important and major fact to know. I actually learned that for the tequila plant, it takes almost 30 years. It doesn't take that long for our plant cherry here. It takes 3 to 4 years for these. And it is very important to know that because you want to make sure you're getting them at the right time where they turn this bright red as you see in the picture. So after the harvesting of the cherries, we then have the processing of the cherries. Basically, as shown in the picture, they lay out a plastic mat and let the cherries just sit there for several weeks. And the exposure from the sun is basically called the dry method, and it is an age-old method of processing coffee, which is still used in many countries, and I believe is still being used as we harvest today. This just lets out all the moisture content that the cherry contains, and it actually drops to 11%. The wet method removes the pulp from the coffee cherry after harvesting. So the bean is completely dried after this process, and that is also known as the drying of the beans, which is what kind of gets the flavor going in the bean. After we have the drying of the beans, we then moved on to the process of the milling of the beans, where it's pretty much the polishing part of the process, and it's going through machinery, which is layering the dry processed coffee beans. And the difference between the two is that there's like grading and sorting, so it pretty much categorizes it and moves it by size and weight. And the beans are also being reviewed for the color flaws, sort of like when you're gonna make beans and you take out any of the ones that you see are not the best. That's pretty much what's happening in this process. And then we go ahead and move on to the exporting of the beans. After the milling process, we then have the exporting of the beans, which is pretty explanatory. They're loaded onto ships and then shipped to wherever they need to be contained. And as you can imagine, with all these coffee shops that we have all over the world, they are being shipped and exported in very large bulks. And we actually have a record that in 2015 to 2016, there was a forecast that we had almost 152.7 million bags, which that's pretty insane to think about. Every day the production of coffee grows, and even nowadays you can see it trending all over the apps. It is a very, very popular product and beverage to drink. After the exporting of the beans, we then have the tasting of the coffee, which every time you're going to have a product sold, you have to make sure that it is up to date and the quality is good. Because then you can just run into trouble if you're not tasting your own product. The coffee is tested for quality and taste, and the process is called cupping, and usually takes place in a room specifically designed to facilitate the process. So they get specific people just for this part of the process, and if the quality is not up to date, then they tend to make adjustments and make sure that it is to the best quality that it can be. And the samples from a variety of batches and different beans are tasted daily, so different flavors. There's Colombian, there's hazelnut, there's so many flavors that all of these are being sampled with specific tasters. After we have the roasting of the coffee, we then have the grinding of the coffee, which, as shown in the picture, they are no longer beans. They are converted into this with this little tool. And fun fact, I actually have an espresso machine, which then turns this powder, which is grinded coffee beans, into shots. And those are really popular in very major coffee shops. You will see those in most coffee shops. This is what gets the flavor extracted. And actually, most roasting machines maintain a temperature of about 550 degrees Fahrenheit. The beans are basically being inserted into a process, and you have to make sure you don't burn it, or else the coffee flavor will be way too dark and too strong. So you have to make sure your coffee beans are being roasted at a complete perfect temperature. And finally, we then have the brewing of the coffee, which it really blows my mind that just a cup of coffee in the morning, you don't know where those coffee beans came from and how long it took just to get that 1 cup of coffee. And just to wrap up my final project today, I wanted to include a few tips of how to get the best tasting quality of coffee. Always make sure you are using a scale just so that you're precise on the different blends and the density of how much you're using. Also, you want to make sure that you're using a whole bean of coffee. That way, you just get the best tasting quality and it just tastes like it came from, who knows, Peru. That's it for today. I really enjoyed getting into the process of coffee and breaking it down. And these are my references that I use for today's project.